When she spotted the shimmer in my backyard, she lost her mind. But when she tried to sue me over a pond that doesn't even exist, I just smiled until she called 911 like I'd committed a felony with a garden hose. Like these stories? Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest stories. The first time I saw her, she was holding a clipboard like it was a badge. She had that kind of walk too, all-purpose and tight shoulders, marching across the sidewalk as if every inch of the cul-de-sac had been issued to her in a military contract. I was standing in my backyard, kneeling by the garden hose, letting it run a slow stream over the roots of my tomatoes. It had been a long day, and I was more focused on the soil than the footsteps behind me. I didn't look up until she cleared her throat. "Is that a pond?" Her tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory, the kind of question that already had a verdict tucked inside it. I stood and followed her gaze to the slight dip in my yard where the water pooled a little before soaking in. It was nothing permanent, just the shallow impression left from last week's landscaping. The grass hadn't fully settled. "No," I said, still holding the hose. "Just watering the garden." She narrowed her eyes. "It's collecting. It drains in about 10 minutes. I don't think that's compliant with HOA standards." At that point, I still didn't know her name. I'd only been in the neighborhood for 2 months, and aside from a few polite nods from the folks across the street, I hadn't had many interactions. She apparently had been waiting for one. She jotted something down on the clipboard and stepped back toward the fence like I was radioactive. I turned off the hose and gave a small shrug, assuming that would be the end of it. That night there was a folded notice on my doorstep. It was written in the kind of legalistic language that tries to sound more official than it is. Unauthorized standing water structure was the term they used, as if I had installed a koi pond instead of splashing a little runoff on some struggling tomato vines. There was no letterhead, no signature, just a printout with highlighters and an ink-smudged map of my backyard. I laughed at first. I mean, how could I not? The structure in question was grass and mud, but the next morning, I noticed something new. A window now had a small camera pointed directly into my yard. And just like that, I realized she wasn't joking. She wasn't annoyed. She was on a mission. 2 days after the note on my doorstep, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was stuffed with printed bylaws and photozone of which showed a darkened patch of my backyard, circled in red ink like it was a crime scene. The letter claimed I was in violation of Section 14.3, subsection D, concerning unauthorized modifications to landscaping resulting in water retention. It was worded like a legal summons, though a quick search told me it had no real authority behind it. Still, the implication was clear. Someone, somewhere, wanted me to feel cornered. I walked across the street to the small brick building that served as our HOA office, hoping to clear things up in person. Inside, the walls were lined with dusty pamphlets on lawn treatments and neighborhood codes, and a flickering fluorescent light made the place feel more like a DMV than a welcoming community hub. Behind the desk sat none other than the clipboard commander herself. She looked up from a stack of manila folders with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm here about this letter," I said, placing it on the counter. Her eyes scanned it, though I suspected she knew exactly what it said. "Everything's outlined there," she replied. "We've had multiple complaints." "From who?" I asked. She looked past me, as if someone else in line might speak up. The room was empty. "I can't disclose that," she said, "but the issue is the pond." "It's not a pond." She tilted her head like she was trying to be patient. "Whether or not you call it that, water accumulation over 24 hours violates policy. It's dry within 15 minutes. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Then you should have no problem resolving it." I left without saying another word. As I stepped out, I noticed an older man in a ball cap tending to his flower bed next door. He looked up and gave me a nod that was more sympathetic than polite. I paused by his gate, unsure if I wanted to vent or just keep walking. "She get to you too?" he asked without needing context. "Trying," I said. He chuckled. "She does this with every new homeowner. My kid built a bird bath once. You'd think he drilled for oil." I laughed, but it was tight in my chest. That night, I stood at the edge of my yard watching the grass where the water had gathered. It was bone dry, the soil already cracking at the edges from the sun. No fish, no lily pads, no sign of life except a pair of dandelions pushing through the fence. I should have felt fine, but something told me this wasn't over. The camera showed up one morning, just above the corner of her second-story window, angled perfectly toward my backyard. It was small, round and black against the white trim, but unmistakable. At first, I wasn't even sure it was real until the sun caught its lens just right. There was no note this time, no knock on the door, just a silent eye watching from behind the curtains. I didn't do anything about it that day. Let her record some footage of me pulling weeds or watching the grass grow. But by the third morning, when I saw her out front adjusting its angle with a small wrench and a ladder, I decided I'd had enough. I didn't call anyone or file a complaint. Instead, I installed a motion-activated sprinkler near the base of the garden. It wasn't fancy, just a rotating head attached to the hose that kicked on when it sensed movement. Mostly I used it for raccoons. Later that week, just as I came home from the hardware store with a bag of mulch, I heard it click on. The sound of spraying water was followed by a high-pitched yelp. I stepped into the backyard to find her standing just beyond the fence, soaked from the waist down, mouth agape, arms stiff at her sides. The sensor had caught her peering over with a phone in hand. "You assaulted me," she snapped. "You walked into my yard," I replied. "The sprinkler doesn't know the difference between you and a squirrel." Her jaw twitched. "This is targeted behavior." "It's a garden sprinkler." She stomped away, leaving wet footprints in the grass behind her, clutching her phone like it was evidence. I thought that would be the end of it again. But later that evening, a patrol car slowed in front of my house, paused, and then rolled on without stopping. I watched from the front window, arms crossed, heart pounding a little harder than I wanted to admit. That night, I began writing everything down. Dates, times, what was said, where she stood. I took a photo of the sprinkler, another of the backyard, and several more of the dry, cracked soil that had somehow sparked all of this. It wasn't fear that made me document it. It was the sense that I wasn't dealing with a neighbor anymore. I was dealing with someone who needed control more than she needed truth. The envelope this time wasn't from the HOA. It came in regular mail, no stamp, just dropped through the slot like a flyer. Inside was a stapled report titled, "Documented Violations, 3rd Notice," printed in bold. A few photos were attached, all of my backyard from different angles. One had been clearly altered. The waterline was darkened, ripples drawn in like a child's art project. I held it up to the light and could see the blur where the edits had smeared the grass. It would have been funny if it wasn't so obsessive. I tossed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it while I made coffee. Her handwriting was scribbled in the margin, little notes like consistent pooling and permanent fixture. I had to wonder how long she'd been compiling this nonsense. Every picture was from a slightly different time of day, meaning she'd either set her camera to record or stood at her window waiting. Neither option sat right with me. Around noon, she showed up again, this time with a plastic folder and a man in uniform. He wasn't aggressive, just confused, holding his radio in one hand and a notepad in the other. Karen didn't say hello. She marched onto the edge of my lawn and pointed at the garden like it was a body at a crime scene. "That's it," she said. "The pond." I glanced at the officer. "Would you call that a pond?" He looked, scratched the back of his neck and said, "Sir, I don't see any standing water." "She just watered it," Karen snapped. "He knows we're coming. He's draining it before we arrive." The officer blinked slowly. "Do you have any proof of that?" Karen handed him the folder. He opened it, flipped through the photos, and then looked back at me with something between amusement and pity. "I'm going to be honest," he said. "This looks like a damp patch of grass." I nodded. "Glad we agree." He handed the folder back. Karen stood there, fuming, but said nothing. The officer gave a short nod and walked back to his car. She lingered for a moment longer, eyes scanning the yard like it might suddenly transform. Then she followed him, muttering to herself. As they drove off, I stood in the same spot and waited until they were out of sight. The sun was high, and the yard was warm. I reached down, touched the dirt, and found it dry as bone. Whatever this was, it had stopped being about water a long time ago. A week passed, and the letters kept coming. This time they were slipped under the windshield wiper of my truck, taped to the side gate, and tucked into the crack of my front door. Each one used slightly different language. But the message never changed. I was being warned. Not just about the so-called pond anymore, but about ongoing visual disturbances, suspicious yard behavior, and even non-conforming irrigation habits. The last one made me laugh out loud. But the laugh didn't last long. It stuck in my throat the way something does when you start to understand it's not funny anymore. Karen had moved beyond HOA language. These letters were trying to sound like legal threats, written in dense blocks with phrases like cease and desist and liable for damages. She was escalating, hoping to wear me down with paperwork and pressure. The kind of thing that, over time, makes you want to roll over just to stop the noise. But I'd grown up around people who knew how to endure noise and how to spot nonsense when it showed up dressed in official language. I started to hear stories. One neighbor told me Karen had tried to report a father across the street for his daughter's trampoline, claiming it violated airspace guidelines. Another said she filed a formal complaint about a wreath that hung on a door too far into January. The more I heard, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about me. It never was. I had just become her newest project. I stopped reacting. I didn't respond to the letters, didn't confront her, didn't water the garden while she was out watching. I let her stew, and while she watched me, I watched her. Or rather, I watched what she did. She circled my yard every morning now, walking her tiny dog who never barked as if it too had given up protesting. She'd stop just at the edge of the property line, glance toward the garden, and scribble something in that same clipboard. So I started writing things down too, not to fight her at first, but to keep myself grounded. I took pictures of my yard at the same time every day. I recorded the sprinkler turning off by itself. I logged every letter she left, every photo she sent, and even the times her dog wandered across the line she was so obsessed with. Late one evening, I sat on the back porch with a beer and watched the moonlight stretch across the lawn. The grass was still, the garden quiet. And there, tucked into the dirt beside my tomato vines, was the motion sensor, blinking gently. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with everything I'd gathered. But I knew this much whatever came next. I wasn't going to meet it empty-handed. The next HOA meeting was held in the same stuffy community center where I first met her. It smelled faintly of air freshener and old carpet, and the folding chairs groaned under the weight of a dozen weary homeowners. I took a seat near the back, not expecting much. Mostly I wanted to see who actually showed up for these things, who nodded when she spoke, who looked away. A few familiar faces were scattered through the crowd, including Tony, who gave me a small grin as I walked in. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, flanked by two men I hadn't seen before. She opened the meeting like a substitute teacher taking attendance, rattling through agenda items no one had asked for. Then she got to mine. Or rather, Item 7, Water Management and Unauthorized Installations. She read from a typed page, voice clipped and steady. According to her, my unauthorized water feature was setting a dangerous precedent. She proposed a motion to amend the HOA bylaws, banning reflective surfaces in residential backyards, not ponds, not sprinklers, reflective surfaces. I looked around the room to see if anyone else had caught the absurdity of that phrase. One woman near the front raised her hand and asked, "Does that include bird baths?" Karen blinked. If they exceed 8 inches in diameter, potentially. Another man followed. "So what about the mirrored art sculpture in my yard? I bought that thing at the art fair last spring." She paused again, the moment slipping out of her control. "Well, we'll need to evaluate those on a case-by-case basis." From behind me, someone let out a small laugh. I turned to see Tony with his arms crossed, watching her like a man who'd seen this movie before. When the motion finally went to a vote, only 3 hands went up. Hers, the man beside her, and one woman who seemed to regret it halfway through. Everyone else kept their arms folded. Karen tried to reframe it, to stall, but it was clear. She didn't have the support she thought she did. After the meeting, Tony caught up with me in the parking lot. He tapped the brim of his cap and said, "You're not the first, but you might be the one she regrets picking." That night, I sat on the porch with the garden lights glowing soft across the grass. No sound but the breeze and the quiet buzz of cicadas. I didn't know exactly what I'd done to earn her wrath. But tonight proved something she didn't want to admit. I wasn't alone. It started with a white van parked on the corner, the kind with a faded logo and a satellite dish mounted awkwardly on the roof. I didn't pay it much attention until I stepped outside and saw a man hoisting a camera onto his shoulder. Behind him was a reporter, a tall woman in a navy dress holding a microphone and scanning the neighborhood with bored eyes. Karen stood next to her in a pink blouse and slacks, smiling like she was hosting a cooking segment. I could hear her voice, even from the porch. She was already in full swing. The news crew had come out to cover a story of unchecked environmental hazards in a residential zone. Karen gestured toward my backyard as if unveiling a crime scene. She pointed out the spot where the grass dipped slightly and waved her folder like it was a warrant. I stayed where I was, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. I had no reason to stop her. If anything, I wanted to see how far she'd take it. The cameraman looked unimpressed. He panned across the lawn, probably expecting a koi pond or algae bloom. What he got was a dry patch of crabgrass and a tomato plant wilting in the heat. I watched the reporter nod politely, then turn to the camera and deliver a few lines that sounded vaguely concerned but empty of any real context. She glanced at me once, then back at Karen, who kept talking long after the crew had stopped recording. They packed up after 10 minutes. No follow-up questions, no request to film from inside the yard. As they drove off, Karen stood alone at the sidewalk, watching them go like something had been stolen from her. I didn't say anything. I just went inside and uploaded my own version of the event. I had kept the footage from my porch camera, the one that showed the crew filming nothing, the one that caught Karen frantically adjusting the way her blouse tucked into her waistband when she saw herself in the van's reflection. I added subtitles, a few light edits, and uploaded it to the Karen Watch page I'd been quietly building for weeks. By morning, the clip had several hundred views. By evening, it had a few thousand. Comments poured in, half of them laughing, the other half angry that someone like her was wasting community time with a fake story. One comment stood out. It said, "She's weaponizing rules against people she can't control." Classic. That night, I watered the garden like always. Karen didn't come outside. Her curtains stayed drawn, and for once, her clipboard wasn't waiting at the edge of the fence. But I had a feeling this wasn't retreat, it was regrouping. It was the sound of my own laughter that set her off. I was leaning on the fence post, talking on the phone with my brother, trying to explain how a garden hose and a depressed patch of lawn had turned into neighborhood news. He kept asking if I was making this up. Every time I said no, he laughed harder, and so did I. We weren't being loud, just amused. I had one foot propped on a stone and a mug of coffee in my hand. The air smelled like wet soil and cut grass. For the first time in weeks, I felt relaxed. Then I heard her gate slam. Karen marched across her driveway like she'd been waiting for an excuse. Her face was red, eyes locked on me. She didn't speak right away. She just stood there at the edge of her property, fists balled tight at her sides. "You think this is funny?" she said finally. I turned, still holding the phone. "What part?" "You know exactly what part." My brother's voice came through the line, muffled and laughing again. I didn't answer her. I just looked down at the ground between us tree, cracked, plain. No water, no reflection, no trick. Just earth and grass. She took out her phone and dialed. I could hear the beeps as she pressed the numbers. I knew what was coming before she said a word. She turned slightly away, but not enough to keep her voice from reaching me. "Yes, this is Karen Delaney. I need an officer dispatched. My neighbor is harassing me. He's taunting me about an illegal pond and making threatening comments." I blinked once, then put my phone down and sat on the porch steps. I didn't feel angry, just tired. Tired of the theater, the lies dressed in panic. The word threatening hung in the air like a mosquito. When the patrol car arrived, it was the same officer from before, tall, brown-haired, and already looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He stepped out of the car, saw me sitting with a mug in my hand, and exhaled through his nose like someone bracing for a rerun. "Ma'am," he said before she could even speak, "is this about the garden again?" Karen started in, fast and breathless, pointing and talking over herself. The officer listened for about 30 seconds before raising a hand. "Is there any water in the yard right now?" "No," she admitted. "Any noise? Any trespassing?" She paused. He turned to me. "Sir, did you speak to her directly?" "No, officer. I was on the phone. She walked over and started yelling. He nodded slowly, then looked back at her. Unless someone's in danger or trespassing, this isn't a criminal matter. Please don't use emergency services for disputes like this again. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even say goodbye. She turned and walked back to her porch without looking over her shoulder. The officer gave me a brief nod and walked off without another word. I sat there a while longer, watching the light fade over the yard. My brother texted a single word: unbelievable. I didn't respond. I just watched the grass and waited for the quiet to settle back in. I found Ruth on a Sunday morning, pulling weeds outside the HOA office. She wore a sun hat and gardening gloves, and didn't look like someone who spent her time writing warning letters. I had seen her around the neighborhood but never realized she had anything to do with the association. When I walked up and introduced myself, she smiled without hesitation and stood to shake my hand. Her grip was firm, and her eyes were clear in a way that made me think she missed very little. I was hoping to talk to someone actually in charge, I said. Well, she replied, wiping dirt from her palms, I've been the president for the past 7 years, at least on paper. I blinked. Karen told me she was the acting president. Ruth gave a dry chuckle. Karen filled in after my husband passed. I took some time away, but I never resigned. She took a little too much initiative, I think. I told her everything. About the pond. That wasn't. The letters, the photos, the fake news crew. She listened with arms crossed and nodded occasionally, her face calm but unreadable. When I finished, she asked to see the letters. I handed her the folder I'd brought, everything I'd been saving in case I ever needed it. She flipped through the pages in silence. At one point, she paused on the photos with the fake ripples and shook her head slowly. She's not supposed to be doing any of this, Ruth said. We have a 3-member board, and I doubt they know half of what she's sending. She's been signing things on your behalf, I added. Ruth looked up at me, not surprised but tired. I figured she might try that. Karen likes to blur lines when people stop paying attention. Can the board do anything? We can audit her actions and issue a formal notice. If she doesn't back off, we can vote to remove her. I nodded. Let me know if you need help making that happen. Ruth smiled again, this time with something sharper behind it. Oh, I will. But in the meantime, just keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. And don't let her bait you. I thanked her and walked home with a strange mix of relief and anticipation. It felt like sunlight after a long week of clouds, but I knew storms didn't pass all at once. Still, there was something solid in having a name behind the title. Something about the way Ruth looked at the facts made it clear she wouldn't let this slide. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the ground under me was more than just dry, it was steady. The invitation came as a printed flyer tucked into every mailbox on the block. It was for a neighborhood barbecue, hosted by Ruth and the HOA board, with the usual promises of hot dogs, iced tea, and a bouncy house for the kids. At the bottom, in smaller print, it read, "A brief reading of bylaw clarifications and community expectations to follow." It didn't sound like much unless you knew the backstory. And by now, most of us did. Saturday brought clear skies and the smell of charcoal from 3 different grills. Neighbors I'd only waved at before stopped to shake my hand. A few clapped me on the back and offered quiet encouragement, like I was the guy who'd taken a hit for the team and was still standing. Even Tony brought over a paper plate stacked with ribs and said, "You earned these." I spotted Karen by the hedges, standing apart from the crowd with her arms crossed and her mouth pulled tight. She wasn't wearing her clipboard today, but the stiffness in her shoulders hadn't gone anywhere. Her eyes tracked Ruth as she moved through the crowd, greeting people, handing out napkins, and making small talk with the ease of someone who actually belonged here. When the sun dipped low and the food was mostly gone, Ruth stepped up to a folding table near the front yard and raised her voice just enough to be heard. She held a binder in one hand and a microphone in the other. "I know some of you have had questions about HOA rules," she said, her tone pleasant but firm, "especially around things like landscaping, irrigation, and property improvements. So we thought we'd clear a few things up today, just to make sure we're all on the same page." She opened the binder and read directly from the bylaws. No dramatic pauses, no interpretation, just the words as written. There was nothing about puddles, no restrictions on reflective surfaces, no clause about water accumulation, unless it caused structural damage or overflowed onto another property. Several neighbors began to smile. A few laughed softly. Karen didn't say a word. She stood there, watching, face pale and unreadable. Ruth closed the binder and looked up. Going forward, all communications from the HOA will come from the full board. Any individual letters or warnings not approved by the board should be disregarded. Someone clapped. Then a few more followed. The mood lightened with a kind of collective exhale. People began talking again. Kids ran past with juice boxes, and someone started up music from a Bluetooth speaker. I didn't approach Karen. I didn't need to. She had already begun to shrink under the weight of her own rules, and this time, no one was standing behind her. I stayed until the last grill was put away and the last chairs were folded. On the walk home, Ruth caught up beside me. "Thanks for staying steady," she said. "Some folks would have cracked." I shrugged. I just wanted to be left alone. She smiled. "That's the funny thing about people like Karen. The quieter you are, the more they try to make noise. But eventually the neighborhood starts listening to the silence instead." I should have known she wouldn't let it go. Not after the barbecue. Not after the bylaws were read in front of a crowd that clapped and laughed while she stood alone. For a week, things stayed calm. Her camera stayed still in the window. Her dog walked the same short path on its leash, and her porch light flicked on at the same time every night. But quiet wasn't the same as finished. Karen was planning, and I didn't see it until the envelope arrived. It was certified mail this time, delivered with a knock and a signature. Inside was a civil complaint, filed at the county courthouse, naming me as the defendant in a case for visual disturbance, repeated yard aggression, and hostile irrigation practices. I read it twice. Then I read it again, slowly, trying to decide if it was a joke. But the stamp was real, the filing number real too, and the court date had been set. Karen had officially taken me to court over a patch of grass. I called Ruth, and she told me to bring everything I had: photos, logs, letters, even the video clips from my porch camera. She wasn't surprised. Disappointed maybe, but not surprised. "She's trying to make you quit," Ruth said. "Not just with the HOA, with the house, with the neighborhood." I didn't say much in return. I just started gathering the file I'd been building since this all began. The evidence was solid. It showed the dry lawn, the nonsense complaints, the sprinkler that shut off within minutes. The absurdity of her claim practically folded in on itself. We both showed up for the hearing. It wasn't a grand courtroom like on television, just a small room with plastic chairs and a judge who looked more interested in the clock than the case. Karen had a folder stuffed with photos and handwritten notes. I had a clean binder with labeled tabs and timestamps. She spoke first, full of urgency and vague emotion. Words like harassment and intimidation floated into the air with nothing to anchor them. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I just showed what I had, piece by piece. I let the judge see how little there really was. It lasted less than 30 minutes. The judge leaned forward, tapped a finger on the desk and said, "This is a lawn dispute, not a legal matter. Case dismissed." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She gathered her papers and left the room without looking at me. I stayed seated for a while, just breathing. Not victorious, not smug, just still. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. The sky was overcast, the kind of grey that makes everything feel quiet. I walked back to my truck with the binder under my arm, and for the first time since this started, I didn't glance over my shoulder. I didn't need to. She had made her move, and it hadn't worked. It started with a duck. Not a real one, but a rubber duck, bright yellow with cartoonish eyes, floating in a plastic kiddie pool in Tony's front yard. I spotted it while walking the dog around the block, sitting there like a quiet little joke. The next day, someone on the next street over added 1-2 only. Theirs was a decorative pond ornament, with a wide grin and a pair of sunglasses painted on. By the end of the week, at least half a dozen yards had something. A fake fish, a tiny lighthouse. One guy even put a mirrored garden ball on a pedestal in the middle of his lawn. No one said a word about it. No signs, no slogans. Just a slow, quiet protest that didn't need explaining. I kept my yard the same. Just the same patch of grass and a few vegetables barely hanging on in the heat. But I noticed people walking by more often. Some gave a little wave. Others just nodded. There was a shared understanding now, something unspoken that pulled the neighborhood a little closer together. Karen didn't take it well. Her curtains were drawn more often, and when she did come out, it was to pace along her property line, snapping photos with her phone and muttering to herself. She filed a few more complaints, this time about intentional community disturbance and malicious decor. The board dismissed them before they ever reached a vote. Then one afternoon she shouted at a group of kids riding their bikes, telling them they weren't allowed to loiter near her mailbox. One of the parents filed a report. Another neighbor mentioned that Karen had stepped onto their lawn to measure a bird bath. That evening, a formal notice was posted on the community board by Ruth and the HOA officers. It was brief and professional. Karen Delaney was no longer recognized as having any leadership role within the association. All concerns or questions were to be directed through proper channels, and the board thanked the neighborhood for their patience during recent misunderstandings. It didn't say her name directly, but it didn't need to. I stood by my window that night, looking out over the yard. A few garden lights glowed softly near the fence, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle. Somewhere nearby, a radio played low and steady. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension humming under the surface. Karen's house was quiet. Her porch light stayed off. I watched her step outside just once, glance up and down the street, then turn and go back in without saying a word. Whatever power she thought she had was gone now, not taken from her but left behind. It rained hard that night, the kind of steady, soaking rain that drummed against windows and left puddles along every curb in the neighborhood. I stood on the back porch with a mug in my hand, watching the water gather in the low spot near the tomatoes. It filled quickly, dark and smooth, then began to spill into the surrounding grass. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just rain doing what rain does. By morning, the whole neighborhood looked the same. Small pools in yards, water clinging to flower beds, reflections of porch lights dancing in the puddles. I wasn't surprised to see Karen outside early, walking her small dog along the sidewalk with a clipboard in one hand and a poncho pulled tight around her shoulders. She moved slowly, eyes darting from yard to yard, as if cataloguing crimes no one had committed. She stopped in front of my house. Her eyes settled on the water near the garden, not deep enough to matter, just enough to ripple with the breeze. She took a photo, then another. Her lips moved like she was rehearsing what she'd say next. A few minutes later, she was in the neighbor's yard, pointing at the mirrored garden ball with the rubber duck beside it. She crouched low to get a better angle, then moved toward the fence. I didn't speak, just watched from the kitchen window. Later that day, I added something new to the lawn. A small, round mirror, the kind used in garden beds to brighten shaded corners. I propped it up with a wire stand and placed it exactly where the puddle had been earlier. It caught the sky perfectly, reflecting clouds and treetops, nothing more. By late afternoon, Karen was back. She stood at the edge of my property, staring at the mirror like it had insulted her. I heard her footsteps cross onto the grass. I opened the door just in time to see her bent down, hand outstretched. She didn't touch it. Instead, she turned and saw me standing on the porch. "You think this is funny?" she asked. "I think it's just a mirror. You're provoking me." "No, I'm gardening." She stood there for a moment, breathing through her nose. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She took one photo, then 2 steps forward. "You're trespassing," I said quietly. She froze. "You've crossed the property line, Karen." She looked down at her feet, then back at me. Something shifted in her face, not quite shame, but close enough to make her hesitate. Without another word, she turned and walked away. That evening, a citation appeared in her mailbox. Not from me, not from the HOA, from the county. Someone had reported repeated trespassing and harassment. I hadn't made the call, but someone had, and they'd done it with a name attached. I watched the sun go down that night, with the mirror still catching the last orange edge of light. The puddle was gone, but the reflection stayed. It didn't take long for the story to spread, not just across the neighborhood, but far beyond it. Someone must have shared one of the videos from the Karen Watch page to a bigger audience, because overnight, the numbers changed. Thousands of views became tens of thousands. The comments rolled in faster than I could read them. People from all over the country chimed in, some with sympathy, others with their own stories. It wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about people like her, about the way control dresses itself up as concern. A local YouTuber did a short feature on it, piecing together clips from my footage with screenshots of the bylaw pamphlets. He kept it light, but his tone held something honest. The kind of voice that laughs not to mock, but to make something ridiculous less heavy. He called it the pond that never was, and by the end of the video, he held up a cup of water and toasted to freedom, dry lawns, and neighbors who mind their own business. That video went viral. From there, everything changed. I didn't expect the letter that came next. It arrived in a simple envelope with no return address, but the letterhead was official. A civil liberties organization had seen the videos and wanted to thank me. Not for fighting back, they said, but for documenting everything with patience and care. They offered to include the footage in a short documentary series about small-town power struggles. I said yes without much thought. It felt like the right kind of full circle. Karen's house got quieter. No more yelling, no more clipboard walks. Her porch light stayed off, and the curtains remained shut. The neighborhood, on the other hand, came to life. People waved more. Some added new decorations to their lawns. Others just planted flowers. One guy started a small newsletter for the block, half joke, half useful, with gardening tips and calendar events. His first issue was titled, "Let the Water Settle." Ruth stopped by one afternoon with a sealed envelope and a smile. She handed it to me without a word and let me read it right there on the porch. Inside was a nomination form for the HOA board, already signed by 5 neighbors. "I think you'd bring balance," she said. I laughed. "I just wanted to grow tomatoes." Sometimes that's exactly the kind of person we need. I didn't answer right away. I looked out over the yard, now calm, familiar. The grass had recovered from the summer heat, the mirror still tucked in the corner, catching nothing but sky. The attention would fade, the views would slow, but I knew what mattered now. The pond had never been real, but the line she crossed had been, and the people who saw it, they were real too. By autumn, the air had cooled and the leaves had started to turn. My garden thinned out, the tomatoes long picked, the last of the herbs gone to seed. The yard felt quieter now, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from tension. It was settled, still, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for anything. Karen's house went up for sale without fanfare. A modest sign appeared at the edge of her lawn one morning, just a simple post with a white placard and a phone number. No balloons, no open house. No one from the neighborhood was surprised. She hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Her car disappeared from the driveway first. Then the camera in the window was taken down. For a long time the house sat empty, shades drawn, porch light off. Someone mowed the lawn once or twice, but that was it. One evening, Tony brought over a couple of cold beers and sat with me on the porch. We watched the wind play through the grass, dry leaves rolling across the sidewalk like quiet messengers. He raised his bottle toward her house and smiled. "Guess she couldn't swim with the neighborhood tide," he said. I shook my head. "She built the storm herself." He nodded, then let the silence stretch. Neither of us needed to say much. The mirror still sat in its little spot by the fence, though it didn't catch much light these days. I thought about moving it, maybe replacing it with something else, but then again maybe not. There was something about leaving it there, like a marker for everything that had passed through this place and moved on. I walked the yard the next morning, dew clinging to the blades of grass, the soil cool under my feet. Where the puddle had once formed, the ground was firm now. Not because I changed anything, but because time had done what it always does. It settled things. I never built a pond, never dug so much as a trench, and yet that shallow dip in the earth became the center of a battle I never asked for. Looking at it now, I didn't see a problem. I saw a reminder that sometimes the quietest places draw the loudest attention, and sometimes the best way to fight noise is with patience, truth, and the refusal to move when you've done nothing wrong. I went inside, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and opened the front window. The breeze was light, cool, and clean. There were no cameras, no shouting, no folded letters waiting on the doorstep. Just a yard, a house, and peace.